I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, in addition to all of the sound and fury coming out of Washington, the recent United Nations Holocaust Remembrance Day and some questions that it has raised inside the Jewish community. And one individual who has spoken eloquently on this subject, as well as many others which address challenges to Jewish life today, is a frequent guest commentator on JBS. You've seen her often. Betty Ehrenberg, Executive Director of the World Jewish Congress of North America. And Betty, it's wonderful to have you on our JBS phones now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Betty, we just observed International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945. The World Jewish Congress established a Twitter post, #WeRemember, to commemorate the day. In general, how did you feel the worldwide commemoration went?
Well, first of all, we were very gratified over the social media. We had about 250,000 responses from all over the world. People who felt motivated and wanted to be on record as remembering what happened during that dark period in history, and who wanted to be counted amongst everyone who would stand up and say, I remember, so that in a time when there's Holocaust denial or Holocaust obfuscation, there are people who say, no, it's very, very important to remember the past so that we never repeat what happened in the future.
That's wonderful. Betty, you were asked a question relating to the Shoah, namely, do you believe a Holocaust can happen here in the United States? What was and what is your response?
I feel that as Jews who live in the diaspora, we are never quiet in our souls and we never rest easy, no matter where we lived or where we live. The lesson of Jewish history teaches us that many diasporas have started well but ended badly, so that we have always to be watching. The Jewish people have to always be vigilant to watch when anti-Semitism decides to show up again. It is somehow some kind of sickness that never goes away, even though we like to feel that we do make strides in trying to combat it and defeat it. We learned that it's somehow something that always stays simmering under the surface, but yet pops up again or rears its ugly head at different times in history. And I think that today we're seeing it on the rise one more time. How many of us thought that after the Holocaust that people would never again want to be anti-Semitic? Hasn't the world learned the lesson of what happens when there is such hatred? But yet we see anti-Semitism coming up in pockets of Europe, in pockets of Latin America, in our country. We're seeing attacks on Jewish students in campuses, on Jewish citizens in synagogues, not always just a swastika drawn on a shul, but even a physical attack. So I think we have to have our eyes open all the time and be on our guard, which is really a sad commentary on the way that we have to live.
Mm-hmm. You and I have discussed this before on JBS. I want to react, and then I want you to respond, and we want to my reaction. The real horror of the Holocaust was that it was initiated by the government. It was a formalized attempt to whip up hatred and to use anti-Semitism, as you say, that it was already in the society. It referred to things that were common myths about who Jews were, and Jews were blamed for the recession in Germany and for its loss in World War I. And it didn't come out of individuals who here or there might be incidental in anti-Semitic acts. I look at America, I don't see any attempt it would be almost, it's unthinkable to me, and I know I will get mail from viewers who say I'm naive. At the moment, I don't see institutionalized anti-Semitism coming out of the American government or the American society. And while, as you say, Betty, there are always some hateful, crazy people, by and large, the vast, 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 vast majority of Americans exhibit no anti-Semitic feelings or actions at all. And so, although I resonate when you say you always have to be vigilant. I don't think that you can ever take it for granted. At the moment, if somebody says to me, "Can it happen here?" my immediate response is there would have to be such a dramatic change in American society that all of the values, all of the safeguards, all the traditions that we have as an immigrant nation, for that matter, would have to change. Unless that happens, it doesn't seem to me that another widespread, virulent, concentrated attack on American Jewry is possible. Now, tell me whether you think I am being, unreasonable or naive.
No, not at all, Mark. I don't think you're unreasonable or naive. I mean, I agree with you. We don't see that now, that kind of a situation. What I do worry about, however, is that once anti-Semitism becomes something that is allowed to be expressed at a grassroots level, it's unfortunately something contagious. I'm not trying to prophesy that we're in for doomsday. Not at all. I don't think that's productive. I'm not trying to fan the fuels of alarm in any way, shape, or form. And I would like to say that both you and I have hope and faith in the American people that such a thing would never be allowed. But looking towards the past, or looking back at the past, it was an enlightened German society
Yes.
that turned over its democracy to Hitler.
Yes.
And that their leadership and intelligentsia were the ones that got together at Wannsee to cook up a devilish and diabolical final solution. There was not one person in that room that did not have either a PhD or another kind of advanced degree, or wasn't an advanced official in the military or the government. So when I'm saying, and perhaps, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors and refugees, and so it could be that I may be more sensitive to the winds of this than some others, and maybe more than is warranted. I still feel that Jewish society today, the American Jewish community today, shouldn't take its freedom for granted, and we shouldn't take the wonderful rights and privileges and the atmosphere that we've grown up in for granted. We should deeply appreciate it and know that it was hard-won. There were times in our country when there were quotas for the acceptance of Jews in universities, for the Jews could not get certain jobs and were not allowed to live in certain areas and buildings, and that this kind of an attitude has not really gone away. So I think it's incumbent upon us to not be complacent and not to settle for a pallid reaction when we see anti-Semitic attacks, and when we see especially them perpetrated against young people. I'm particularly worried about attitudes on campus.
Yes.
Students are vulnerable. Students are young. They've grown up with expectations of a safe existence and acceptance in this country, and we can't be naive about that.
Yes. By the way, I wanted to follow up on that, and in some way I'm taking the other position now. One of the things that does bother me, and you and I, again, have spoken about this, and you're eloquent about it, I'm very concerned with, you mentioned a moment ago, it was the intelligentsia that had a major role in Nazi Germany. Right now we're seeing it's in the halls of academia that some of the most virulent anti-Israel expressions are heard, And I am concerned, Betty, that anti-Israel rhetoric is veiled anti-Semitism, and that it concerns me because it may influence a portion of the next generation of American leadership who are right now in college universities. Speak for one moment whether you fear that, again, the anti-Israel rhetoric is in fact a form of anti-Semitism.
I think it absolutely is a form of anti-Semitism. In 2004, the first conference on anti-Semitism, sponsored by the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, was held in Berlin. It was the first conference on anti-Semitism that was held in Berlin. And Colin Powell, at the time, was Secretary of State and was sent by the President of the United States to represent our country there. And in his speech at that conference, Colin Powell said, absolutely, that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism because it holds Israel to be to double standards.
Yes.
And that it castigates Israel in ways that characterize Israel in terms of Nazis, in terms of apartheid, all kinds of words that don't belong with Israel even in the same sentence. So that when we find today anti-Israel activity on campus, whether it's perpetrated by so-called students for justice in Palestine, who are usually not students at all, but adult provocateurs who come on campus to make trouble, or anti-Israel views that are held by academics, as you mentioned before, professors who have their own prejudices and perpetrate them in classrooms, then what I see, and I agree with you completely, that we're seeing a form of anti-Semitism being legitimized by academia and actually taught to young minds in colleges and universities. And I think our community is worried about it, understands it, but still has yet to find more and better effective ways of fighting it.
You say it beautifully, and again, we agree 100%. And it is my hope that, as you suggest, the American Jewish community will come up with strategies to counter what is being preached by some professors on college campuses. It's a very complicated, subtle issue to address. Betty, I have a related issue that I want you to speak to. It's received a great deal of attention in the Jewish community. And look, as we're speaking right now, world attention, if certainly American attention, but world attention is being paid to the executive order that Donald Trump passed, having to do with who can come into the country from which countries. And there's just a great deal of Jewish fury, and it cuts across all movements. There was a piece in the Jewish Week that, or I think the Jewish Week or World Jewish Daily, I'm not sure, which reflected on the fact that, oh, holy cow, the Reform, Conservative, Structuralist, and Orthodox finally have something to agree on. My own feeling, by the way, is that we will deal with it on JBS only if there's a way in which I feel we can add to the overall discussion. But another side issue was that a Jewish aide to Donald Trump, Boris Epstein, wrote the White House Holocaust Statement for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that in the statement written that came out of the White House, no mention was made of the unique Jewish suffering and the murder of the 6 million. Press Secretary Sean Spicer then said that criticisms of that fact, criticisms of the statement were, quote, pathetic, quote, disappointing. What's your sense of the fact that the White House comes out with a briefing? By the way, we should mention both President Bush and President Obama made a point of saying that the principal aim of the Holocaust was the genocide of the Jews. They made that statement in relation to International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Should anything be made out of the fact that the White House left the Jewish element of the Holocaust out of its statement when many of us are aware of the fact that Jared Kushner is in the White House, Ivanka is in the White House, David Friedman is now part of the administration. There's a strong Jewish element. And so the question is, would Jews be making too much of the fact that the Holocaust was not mentioned in the White House comment, or do you feel it is something significant?
Well, I think it's very important that it was mentioned and that the message was conveyed to the White House. I think that something that you mentioned resonates, this idea that we sometimes let others tell us that Jews make too much of the Holocaust, when in reality, the Holocaust was unique, as you said, in terms of it being the first, hatred, slaughter that was perpetrated upon Jews using modern and scientific methods and mechanisms, and was endorsed by the intellectuals and the scientists of its time. I think that we have to be careful about the universalization of the Holocaust. No doubt, the Holocaust has lessons to teach us about, and should teach us about, what happened in Rwanda and Cambodia and in the other tragedies of our time. However, we can't let those who would like to make us feel guilty about mourning our parents and grandparents and relatives. I mean, first of all, 70 years is still a relatively short time in a matter of history, and many of us have relatives only a generation or two back who perished in the Holocaust.
Yes.
And that certainly counts as a wound that is still fresh in many ways. And second of all, it was a unique lesson to Jewish people that we can no longer afford to be helpless ever again. It was a unique lesson to the Jewish people that helped give rise to the consciousness that Jews have to defend themselves, and how crucial it is that Jews have a Jewish state and our Jewish homeland in which we can defend ourselves and determine our own fate. That's very important, and I think it's just one of the principles that has formed your life and my life, Mark. I mean, it's something that was just a momentous thing in history, and I think the Holocaust, certainly not the cause or the reason that the Jewish state came to being. That is about our historic return to our homeland. But the Holocaust shows us that anti-Semitism is a unique kind of hatred that never goes away.
Yes.
And because of that, no, we do not make too much of it. No, we are not crybabies. And no, the Holocaust is not something that should be denuded of its Jewish element. Look, there is a movement in Europe. We find it in Eastern Europe. It's something called Holocaust obfuscation. It's the kind of a phenomenon where we get told by certain Eastern European governments that, yes, they too were victims of the Nazis. And by the way, they also suffered from communism. And by the way, the Jews were communists. So what happens is that you have the Holocaust. The Nazis victimized everybody. It wasn't something that had particularly targeted Jews. And by the way, they also suffered from communism. And by the way, this leads into a kind of an anti-Semitism because many Jews were communists. So you have something here that leads from a kind of a masking or a cover-up of the fact that Jews particularly were targets in the Holocaust into an anti-Semitic canard. Oh, the Jews were the communists and we suffered from the communists. So it's really, really a problem. It's a bigger problem than we think.
Yes. Well, again, you say it so well. My instinct, Betty, is that while I was very disappointed that the statement that came out of the White House did not specifically reference the fact that Jews were the targets, millions upon millions of people died in World War II, and many people died in the Holocaust. But the truth is that while others were victims, all Jews were victims. It was meant first to extinguish, to annihilate, to eradicate one people, us. And I wish the White House had made reference. My instinct is that Epstein just made a mistake, that what we're seeing right now has less to do with venality and more to do with what people were worried about, a certain lack of experience and even competence. And that my own sense was this was an oversight. In no way did the White House mean to suggest that they were less sensitive to the Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. Do you share my feeling, or you see it differently?
I think that, first of all, I think probably next year we will see hopefully a changed statement or a slightly different statement from the White House. What I think is that there are many Jews who try to, and I don't fault anyone for this, who try to make the society at large to understand that when there is hatred such as this, it starts with the Jews, but it doesn't always end with the Jews. And so anti-Semitism, while a unique and targeted hatred, is really something that hurts everybody. And maybe this was something that someone was trying to say but did not say it well.
Yes,
so
I agree.
That there are really two pieces of this puzzle. Number one, the hatred of the Jews, and two, the diminishing of society at large because of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And we see that from the ancient times. I mean, we are now, as you know, Mark, you're a rabbi, we're reading the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot in Shul every Shabbat, and we're talking about the Jews who are enslaved in Egypt.
Yes.
And we see how the Pharaoh tried at the beginning. He called his wise men together, his top echelon, his intelligentsia, to try and see what to do about the Jewish question. And in the end, it was the Egyptians suffered for all of this, for what they did and what they tried to perpetrate. But the Jews came away with a legacy and a journey to their promised homeland that was promised to Abraham. So it's our job to defend our position and our claim to our homeland, and to fight anti-Semitism wherever we see it.
Yes, you have reminded all of us this is not a new problem the Jews have dealt with. When the children of Israel were slaves, and even when Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah and Rachel were in Canaan, there was a certain kind of hatred that at one point became morphed into what you and I know as anti-Semitism. I want to ask you about one more issue. You've already mentioned you are the child of survivors, correct?
Yes.
Where were your parents, by the way, during the Holocaust?
My father was an Auschwitz survivor. I originally was born in Krakow. Grew up was very young when he was taken away. He and his father were taken away to the camps. My mother was born in Frankfurt, and her family fled Kristallnacht after they saw the synagogue burning down the street.
Okay. And when did they come to America?
My mother came as a child 1 year after Kristallnacht. My grandfather, who was a rabbi and a physician in Frankfurt, fled immediately because the Gestapo came the next day looking for people who were known in the community leaders, professionals, and fled immediately. It took him a year. Was really very, very fortunate. It took him a year when he came to America to get visas for my grandmother and the 4 children, of which my mother was the oldest, and she came here, I guess it was 1939. She must have been a child of about 7 or 8 years old. And my father came after the camps were liberated. My father came spent some time in Antwerp with some of his fellow survivors, people he had known from Poland before, but he had no more mother, no more father, no more sisters, and came a while after, actually with the bub of a Rebbe, who came to New York.
Okay. All right. So we only have a moment or two, so you can't take a long time with an answer. But I wanted to know, from your perspective, how much of a parallel is there between the Jewish immigration during the Shoah and present-day Muslim immigration? Because there are many people who are trying to say that the two are the same, and that therefore the Jews who had problems coming into America during the Holocaust should have empathy for those Muslims who want to come in now. And I absolutely agree that we should be empathetic and sympathetic to anyone facing any kind of threat to life, anyone seeking asylum. My own instinct, however, is that people make a serious error comparing the Jew who had nowhere to go, Betty, nowhere, with the immigrant Muslim population that wants to come into America. And I'm asking you, how do you compare the two?
Well, first of all, I do agree with you. There were Jews who had just nowhere to go. Today, what is different today is that there are people who of good intent, who are seeking asylum and who need help. But there are also those who want to come and harm the United States. So we do have to vet people. I guess that's the word that's being used. People have to be looked into. We want, certainly people in the United States have a wonderful historical record of helping people and aiding the asylum seekers, no doubt. But we also now live in a time when we saw September 11th, and who was smart enough to know, oh, look at these strange guys out in California taking flight lessons. So people should have been carefully looked at, and we should have been smarter about that. We don't want to have a repetition here of what happened in Toulouse, or with Charlie Hebdo, or with the Hippocusher grocery store, or in Nice, and so completely open borders as they have in Europe. Look, they are now thinking about that twice in Europe. So we have to be careful and have a balanced policy. On the one hand, welcoming those who really need our help, and carefully vetting those, and not allowing those who wish to do us harm to come in and do so.
Well, Betty Ehrenberg, you know, one of the nicest things that's happened to me because of my work with JBS is becoming a friend of yours, and you being a friend of mine, and being able to share your wisdom and your insight and your loveliness personally, and also to share it with the JBS audience. You are always most thoughtful and most lovely, and I appreciate your time that you always give me here on JBS. You be well, and we'll talk again soon.
It is my honor to know you, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you, darling.
Thank you.
The thoughts of Betty Ehrenberg, Executive Director of the World Jewish Congress of North America. As always, my thanks to our Director, Sloan Copeland, Program Coordinator, Serge Goldberg, Editor, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, to JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producers of In the News, Kara Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.